What if I told you there is one command that could cut your Docker setup time in half? Today, I am not just going to talk about it, I will prove it with a live challenge. Watch me build a multi container application under 5 minutes with just one command that most Docker users overlook. Hey there! If you have been using Docker, you know the pain of managing multiple containers, networks, and volumes. Today, I'm going to show you how the Docker Compose is going to completely transform this workflow. I'm going to demonstrate with real code, not just the theory. Let's start with a real world scenario. Let's say we want to build 3 application containers that talks to a MySQL database container and uses Redis cache. As a traffic cop, there is a load balancer which handles the request from the end user and distributes the load across the application containers. This requires lots of Docker commands and requires careful configurations. Let's quickly revisit how to set up this complex application stack using the traditional Docker commands. We need to create the custom networks, Docker volumes, spin up the containers using the Docker run command. In our case, the Docker run command is going to take many arguments. This means the Docker run command is going to fill up the screen, and any small typos that we make in the Docker run command, we got to revisit and rerun the Docker run command, which is going to take a lot of time. Let us now understand the various problems and challenges in implementing these kinds of complex application stack using the traditional Docker approach. Too many commands to remember, and when we are stuck in the maze of commands, it takes a lot of effort in just setting up the development environment. How do we scale up or down the containers? How do we consistently promote these kinds of setup across environments? And finally, how do we tear down the Docker resources used in the application stack gracefully? Now let's see how the Docker Compose is going to simplify this workflow. Instead of using a tangle of commands, we will just use one YAML file and a single command to replicate the same environment but more efficiently. First step, we are going to create our Docker Compose YAML file. This is where the real magic happens. In this configuration file, we are going to define our application stack that connects all the services together. Think of it as a blueprint to build our entire application infrastructure. We will be building 4 services through this Docker Compose YAML file: the app, MySQL, Redis, and the load balancer. We will create 2 custom networks, front-end and back-end. All our application containers will go into the front-end network and the back-end network. The Redis and the MySQL containers will go into the back-end network. The load balancer will stay in the front-end network. The MySQL requires data persistence, for which we create a Docker volume. With everything defined in the single file, our entire application architecture is now documented, readable, versionable, and shareable. This is infrastructure as a code at its finest. Now it is time for action. Before we get into the demo, let us review some of the files that you're seeing on my screen in my current directory. The Docker Compose YAML file, as you know by this time, is used to build the application stack across environments. It could be dev, QA, prod, and each environment has got unique configuration variable settings. We have externalized that into .dev for dev environment, .prod for production environment, and .qa for QA environment. I am going to run the Docker Compose up command and watch the magic now. Look at how the Docker resources have been created in the correct order and how the dependencies are managed correctly. Awesome, right? Let us quickly review this command, whatever we have executed, before we go to the next step. This command is going to use our Docker Compose YAML file to create and start the containers. It is going to use the configuration information that is defined inside our .dev file. Pretty simple. Okay. So next step is, how do we list all the containers that were created using Docker Compose? Let us see the command in action now. Docker Compose PS command is going to list all the containers that were created using Docker Compose. Now we have done all our work in dev. Now it is time to deploy the same application stack in our QA environment. Let us see how to do that. So this command is going to use the same Docker Compose YAML file which I've used in dev to build the application in QA. But the only difference is we are passing the .qa, that is QA specific configuration information. Let us see the command in action. Awesome. Now let us query the list of containers that were created using Docker Compose in the QA environment. So we have 3 application container, 1 database, Redis cache, and a load balancer container. Awesome. As we move the applications from one environment to the higher environment, the requirements for scaling actually increases. Okay, so let's say we are in the QA environment and now there is a requirement to scale our containers. Either you could go into the Docker Compose, you could do it, or from the command line you could do it. Either way is fine. So we don't want to change anything in the Docker Compose YAML file. So I'm going to show you exactly how to do it from the command prompt. So the environment is QA and we want to scale our application container. This app is what we have mentioned in our Docker Compose YAML file, the service name. Okay. And we want to scale it to 5. So now if we query Docker Compose PS, we should see 5 application containers. Similarly, let's say we want to scale down the containers, let's say from 5 to, let's say 1. Let's do that. Now, when we issue Docker Compose PS, we see there is only 1 application container and the rest we have not done any changes. Finally, we need to clean up our Docker resources, containers, networks, custom networks, Docker volumes. Docker Compose has got a clean way to tear down these resources. Let us see the command in action now. We want to tear it down for QA and just issue the down command. Sorry, it's a mistake. .qa. And now if we issue Docker Compose PS command, there are no resources. Awesome. I challenge you to try this yourself. Take a complex Docker setup and convert that into Docker Compose. Time it before and after. I guarantee you will be shocked to see the difference. That is the power of Docker Compose, a single command that completely changes your workflow. If this has saved you time, hit the subscribe button and let me know in the comments what is the most complex Docker setup you have transformed to Docker Compose. See you.